What happens when Hollywood's most laid-back philosopher walks onto a stage built for sharp questions and finds himself face-to-face with a host who isn't afraid to challenge him on everything he stands for? Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to the Truth Narrator, like this video, and drop a comment below, because this story, it's one you won't forget. The studio lights were warmer than usual that morning, glowing like a silent warning. The applause sign blinked on and off as the audience filled the seats with polite chatter and nervous anticipation. The View had hosted presidents, actors, activists, and scandals, but there was a different kind of electricity humming through the air today. Something unspoken. Something waiting. Matthew McConaughey stood just beyond the curtain, hands loosely clasped, eyes half closed in that familiar calm that had become part of his public identity. To most, he looked relaxed. To those who knew him well, this was his thinking pose, the way he grounded himself before walking into a space where words could turn into weapons. He wasn't there to promote a movie. He wasn't there to sell a memoir. He was there to talk about unity, about listening, about the cultural divide he'd been speaking openly about in recent months. And he knew not everyone appreciated his tone. Across the stage, seated at the familiar curved table, Whoopi Goldberg adjusted her glasses and glanced at her notes. Her expression wasn't hostile. It was sharp, curious, prepared. Joy Behar whispered something to her, and Whoopi gave a short nod without breaking her focus. The producer's voice cut through the air. 30 seconds. The audience clapped on cue as the theme music rolled. The hosts smiled for the camera, their energy polished and bright. And today, Whoopi announced with a steady voice, we're joined by Academy Award winner, author, and someone who's been speaking out about bringing people together across political lines. Matthew McConaughey. The crowd erupted into applause as Matthew walked out, waving gently, his smile easy, almost disarming. He hugged each host, shook hands, and took his seat. For a moment, everything felt cordial. Polite. Almost too polite. Whoopi began. Matthew, you've been talking a lot about unity lately. About finding common ground. Some people have praised you. Others say you're oversimplifying very serious issues. What do you say to that? Matthew leaned back slightly, nodding as if he expected the question. Well, Whoopi, I think when we stop listening to each other, we lose the plot. I'm not saying the issues aren't serious. I'm saying we can't solve them if we're yelling from opposite sides of the room. A few audience members clapped softly. Whoopi didn't. She tilted her head. But isn't there a point where listening becomes tolerating things that shouldn't be tolerated? A faint murmur moved through the crowd. Matthew's smile didn't fade, but his eyes sharpened. Depends on what you mean by tolerated. I'm talking about understanding why someone thinks the way they do, not agreeing with it. Joy leaned forward. But Matthew, when you say both sides, some people hear you equating harmful views with legitimate ones. The temperature in the room shifted. Subtle. Noticeable. Matthew paused longer this time. I'm not equating. I'm saying if we don't understand how people get to those views, we'll never change anything. Whoopi crossed her arms gently on the table. So you think the problem is misunderstanding, not accountability? Matthew exhaled through his nose, still calm, but now clearly more engaged. I think it's both. Accountability without understanding creates more division. Understanding without accountability creates chaos. The audience was silent now. Whoopi leaned forward slightly. That sounds good, Matthew. It really does. But for people who feel directly harmed by policies and rhetoric, understanding can feel like a luxury they don't have. There it was. The first real edge. Matthew nodded slowly. And I hear that. I really do. But if we only operate from hurt, we stop seeing the human being on the other side. Whoopi's voice grew firmer. Sometimes the human being on the other side is actively choosing to hurt others. A ripple of tension ran across the table. Even the co-hosts sat back, watching. Matthew's posture changed. Not dramatically, but enough. He leaned forward now. And sometimes they're operating from fear they don't even understand themselves. Whoopi didn't blink. Fear doesn't excuse harm. No, Matthew replied, his tone deepening. But it explains it. And if you don't understand it, you can't stop it. The audience could feel it now. This wasn't promotional banter. This was a real conversation. Whoopi's eyes locked onto his. You sound like you're asking people to empathize with those who refuse to empathize with them. Matthew's voice dropped, almost a whisper but still carrying across the studio. I'm asking people to be the bigger person. A sharp inhale from somewhere in the audience. Whoopi sat back slightly. That's easy to say when you're not the one carrying the weight. Matthew's jaw tightened for the first time. Just slightly. I'm not pretending to carry anyone's weight. I'm saying we're never going to put the weight down if we keep adding to it. Silence. The kind that doesn't belong on daytime television. Whoopi tapped her pen lightly on the table. So what you're really saying is, everyone just needs to calm down. Matthew shook his head gently. No, I'm saying everyone needs to listen before they speak. Whoopi's expression changed, not angry but firm. Some people have been listening for decades, Matthew. They're done listening. The air felt thick. Matthew looked out toward the audience, then back at Whoopi. And maybe that's exactly why we're stuck. A few people clapped hesitantly. Others didn't. Whoopi's voice softened, but the steel remained. You're asking for patience from people who feel like they've run out of it. Matthew met her gaze steadily. And you're asking for change without conversation. That line hung in the air like a dropped glass. The hosts exchanged glances. The audience shifted in their seats. This was no longer an interview. It was a clash of philosophies, and neither of them was backing down. The applause that usually followed commercial breaks returned in a thinner wave, as if the audience itself wasn't sure whether to clap or brace. The cameras came back on, red lights blinking like quiet witnesses. Matthew sat a little closer to the table now. Whoopi hadn't moved at all. What had started as a conversation had turned into something heavier, a quiet tug-of-war between two people who both believed they were defending something important. Whoopi adjusted her papers, though she didn't look down at them. Matthew, I want to be clear, she began, her tone measured but unmistakably firm. Nobody here is against dialogue. But for many people, dialogue has been happening for years with very little to show for it. Matthew nodded slowly. I get that frustration. But do you? Whoopi asked gently, not as an attack, but as a challenge. Because from where you sit, asking for more conversation doesn't cost you much. For others, it costs them emotionally, mentally, sometimes even physically. A hush swept across the room. Matthew leaned in, elbows now resting lightly on the table. You're right. It doesn't cost me the same. I'm aware of that. But if the people who can afford to keep talking stop doing it, then what? Joy chimed in softly, sensing the weight in the room. Are you saying it's the responsibility of those with privilege to keep the bridge open? Matthew didn't hesitate. Yes, exactly that. Whoopi's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in deep scrutiny. But what if the bridge leads to nowhere? What if you're inviting people onto a path they have no intention of walking? Matthew took a breath. Then at least you tried to build it. A few audience members nodded. Others folded their arms. Whoopi's voice grew more pointed. Trying isn't always enough for people who are tired of surviving. Matthew's calm demeanor began to show the faintest cracks. His words were still steady, but his pauses were longer now. So what's the alternative? He asked. We stop trying? We retreat into our corners and wait for the other side to disappear. Whoopi replied instantly. No, the alternative is demanding change instead of negotiating for it. The tension sharpened. Matthew tilted his head. Demanding without engaging usually ends in louder shouting. Whoopi countered. And engaging without demanding usually ends in being ignored. The audience murmured again, this time louder. Sonny Hostin leaned back, whispering to Joy. This is getting real. Matthew's gaze didn't leave Whoopi. I'm not saying people shouldn't demand change. I'm saying they should also understand the people they're demanding it from. Whoopi's lips pressed into a thin line. Some people understand very clearly. They just don't care. That line landed hard. Matthew blinked slowly, absorbing it. And you believe there's no way to reach them? Whoopi didn't answer immediately. She looked out toward the audience, then back at him. I believe some people don't want to be reached. A long pause followed. Matthew finally spoke, softer now. Then we have to prove them wrong. Whoopi's eyes flickered with something new. Not resistance, but curiosity mixed with disbelief. You really believe that, don't you? I do, Matthew said quietly. Because I've seen people change when someone took the time to hear them instead of hate them. The word hate lingered uncomfortably in the air. Whoopi leaned back. You're describing an ideal world, Matthew. We live in a very real one. And the real one gets worse when we stop believing in the ideal, he replied. Joy jumped in again. But Matthew, people watching this right now might feel like you're telling them to be patient with injustice. Matthew shook his head firmly. I'm telling them to be strategic with how they fight it. Whoopi's voice dropped an octave. For some, fighting is surviving. Matthew looked at her with an expression that was no longer philosophical. It was personal. And surviving shouldn't mean losing your ability to see another human being as human. The room fell still. Whoopi spoke more slowly now. You keep coming back to humanity. But humanity hasn't always been returned in kind. Matthew nodded. That's exactly why someone has to keep offering it. The audience was split. Some clapped lightly. Others sat with arms crossed, visibly unconvinced. Whoopi leaned forward again. Let me ask you something directly. Do you think people are too angry right now? Matthew didn't hesitate. Yes. A collective inhale swept the room. Whoopi's eyebrows lifted. Too angry? Yes, he said, calm but unwavering. Not because the anger isn't justified, but because anger, when it runs too long, stops being useful. Whoopi's tone sharpened. Anger has fueled every major change in history. Matthew nodded. Yes, but it wasn't anger alone. It was anger guided by understanding. Whoopi shook her head slightly. That sounds like you're asking people to dilute their emotions. I'm asking them to direct them, Matthew replied. The silence between them now felt like a living thing. Whoopi tapped the table gently. You're very good with words. Matthew smiled faintly. I've had practice. But words don't always translate to reality, she said. Neither does silence, he replied. The audience reacted audibly to that. Whoopi held his gaze. You believe conversation is the cure. I believe conversation is the beginning, Matthew corrected. She nodded slowly. And what if the other side refuses to talk? Matthew's voice softened again. Then we talk anyway. A few audience members laughed nervously, unsure if he was serious. He was. Whoopi looked at him with a mix of admiration and frustration. You're asking for a level of grace that many people don't feel they owe anymore. Matthew answered quietly. Grace isn't about what you owe. It's about who you choose to be. That line hit the room like a dropped pin. Even the co-hosts were silent now. Whoopi studied him for a long moment. You really think this approach can work in today's climate? Matthew met her stare. I think it's the only thing that can. The cameras stayed close on their faces. No smiles. No jokes. No commercial relief. Just two people locked in a philosophical standoff, both speaking for millions who weren't in that room. And the audience could feel it. This wasn't television anymore. This was something raw. A producer's voice faintly counted down in the studio earpieces, but neither Matthew nor Whoopi seemed to hear it anymore. The conversation had moved beyond the structure of the show, beyond timed segments and rehearsed rhythms. It had settled into something unfiltered, something that made even the crew stand still behind the cameras. Whoopi broke the silence first, her tone quieter now, but somehow heavier. Matthew, let me ask you this in a different way. Do you think people who are hurting right now are wrong for not wanting to hear the other side anymore? Matthew didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the table for the first time since sitting there, fingers lightly tapping the wood as if searching for the right words in the grain. No, he said finally. I don't think they're wrong. I think they're exhausted. Whoopi nodded once. That's fair. But, Matthew continued, lifting his eyes back to hers, exhaustion can make you give up on things you still need. The audience leaned in without realizing it. Whoopi tilted her head. Like what? Like the belief that people can change, Matthew said. Whoopi's lips parted slightly, then closed again. She seemed to weigh his words instead of pushing back immediately. Sonny spoke gently. Matthew, you keep coming back to the idea that people can change if we just talk long enough. But history shows that some changes didn't happen because of conversation. They happened because people were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Matthew nodded. Absolutely. But those confrontations still required someone to articulate those truths. To speak them. To be heard. Whoopi interjected. But being heard and being listened to are not the same thing. Matthew smiled faintly. That might be the most important thing said today. A ripple of soft laughter broke the tension for half a second before settling again. Whoopi leaned forward, resting her chin lightly on her hand. You seem very certain that people are still willing to listen. I'm not so sure anymore. Matthew's voice grew quieter, more reflective. I travel a lot. I talk to people from all kinds of backgrounds. And you'd be surprised how many of them don't actually hate each other. They just don't understand each other. And nobody's helping them bridge that gap. Whoopi responded calmly. Or maybe they understand each other perfectly and still disagree. Matthew nodded. That happens too. Then what? She asked. Then we learn how to disagree without dehumanizing, he replied. That word again. Dehumanizing. Whoopi exhaled slowly. You really believe dehumanization is the core issue? I do, Matthew said. Because once you stop seeing someone as human, you stop caring what happens to them. The audience had gone completely still. No whispers. No shifting. Whoopi's gaze softened just slightly. And you think we're already there? Matthew didn't hesitate. I think we're dangerously close. Joy leaned in. So what's the first step back? Matthew answered without pause. Listening without preparing your rebuttal. Whoopi gave a faint smile. That's harder than it sounds. I know, Matthew admitted. I catch myself doing it all the time. That honesty landed differently. Whoopi studied him. You're not speaking from theory, are you? Matthew shook his head. No, I'm speaking from mistakes I've made. Times I dismissed people before I heard them. Times I judged before I understood. A shift moved through the room. This wasn't debate anymore. It was confession. Whoopi asked gently. And what did you learn from that? Matthew's eyes flickered with something personal. That most people don't want to be villains in their own story. They're usually reacting to something they're afraid of losing. Whoopi nodded slowly. Fear again. Yes, Matthew said. Fear is louder than hate. We just label it differently. Whoopi considered that. And you think addressing fear is the key? I think acknowledging it is, he replied. A long pause followed, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Whoopi finally spoke. You know, Matthew, people might watch this and say you're being naive. Matthew smiled gently. I've been called worse. A few audience members chuckled softly. But naive people don't usually think this deeply, Whoopi added. Matthew shrugged lightly. Maybe I'm stubborn instead. Whoopi smiled for the first time in several minutes. That I can believe. The tension eased just a fraction, but the weight of the conversation remained. Whoopi straightened in her chair. Let me ask you something more personal. Why does this matter so much to you? Matthew didn't hesitate. Because I have kids, and I don't want them growing up in a world where shouting is the only way people know how to communicate. Whoopi's expression softened visibly. That's something I understand. Matthew continued, his voice steady but emotional underneath. I don't want them inheriting a country where people don't even try to understand each other anymore, where disagreement automatically means hatred. Whoopi nodded slowly. You're worried about the future. I'm worried about the present becoming permanent, he said. That line hung heavy in the air. Sonny glanced at Whoopi, then back at Matthew. So in your mind, this isn't about politics. It's about culture. Matthew answered firmly. Exactly. Whoopi leaned back, thoughtful now instead of confrontational. You're asking people to do emotional labor they may not feel capable of anymore. Matthew nodded. And I'm saying it might be the most important work left to do. The audience absorbed that in silence. Whoopi finally said, You know what's interesting? I don't think we disagree as much as it sounds like we do. Matthew's eyebrows lifted slightly. I was starting to think the same thing. She smiled faintly. I just don't have your optimism. Matthew returned the smile. And I might not have your realism. For the first time since the segment began, there was a sense that the clash had turned into something else, a mutual recognition that both perspectives came from a place of concern, not opposition. But the emotional intensity of what had been said still lingered in the room like static electricity. And everyone watching could feel it. This conversation had gone somewhere neither of them expected. When the final commercial break ended, the studio didn't feel like a television set anymore. It felt like the aftermath of a storm that had passed through quietly, but left everything subtly rearranged. The applause sign lit up again, but this time the clapping was slower, more thoughtful. The audience wasn't reacting out of habit. They were responding to what they had just witnessed. Whoopi looked toward the camera, then back at Matthew, as if deciding how to close something that had grown far beyond a segment on a daytime show. You know, she said, her voice calm but reflective, this might be one of the most honest conversations we've had at this table in a long time. Matthew gave a small nod. I appreciate you being willing to have it. Whoopi smiled faintly. Not everyone would. Joy added quietly. And not everyone would stay as calm as you did. Matthew let out a soft breath through his nose. I wasn't as calm inside as I looked. A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the audience, breaking the intensity just enough to let everyone exhale. But the weight of the discussion still lingered. Whoopi turned slightly toward him. I still don't fully agree with you. Matthew nodded. I wouldn't expect you to. She continued. But I understand you better now. And that, Matthew replied, is exactly what I was hoping for. That line landed with a kind of quiet finality. The cameras zoomed in slightly, catching the subtle shift in their expressions. This wasn't a victory for either side. It was something rarer, mutual respect born from disagreement. Whoopi addressed the audience. Conversations like this are uncomfortable. But maybe that's the point. Matthew added. Comfort hasn't gotten us very far lately. The audience clapped, louder this time, not for entertainment, but for acknowledgement. As the segment wrapped, the hosts thanked Matthew, and he stood to shake hands again. But something different happened this time. Whoopi stood up too. She didn't usually do that for every guest. They embraced briefly. Not as opponents, not even as co-host and guest, but as two people who had just walked through something emotionally demanding together. The audience noticed. The cameras caught it, and within minutes of the show ending, clips of the exchange were already spreading across social media. Some viewers praised Matthew for his calm, measured approach. Others applauded Whoopi for challenging him without backing down. Comment sections lit up with debates, arguments, and reflections. This is how discussions should happen. No, this is exactly what's wrong. They're both right. They're both missing the point. News outlets began picking up the clip. Headlines didn't frame it as a fight. They framed it as a rare, raw moment of unscripted honesty on live television. Because that's what it was. Backstage, Matthew gathered his things quietly. A producer thanked him for keeping it respectful. He just smiled and said, "That was the easy part." Whoopi, walking past him on her way to another segment, paused briefly. "Hey," she said. Matthew turned. "Don't stop having these conversations." He nodded. "You neither." And with that, they parted ways. But the conversation didn't end there. It continued online, in living rooms, in comment sections, in debates between strangers who had watched the same exchange and walked away with completely different interpretations. Because the real power of what happened wasn't who won. It was that nobody did. What viewers saw was two strong voices refusing to shout over each other. Two people disagreeing without turning each other into enemies. Two perspectives colliding without exploding. And in a world where conflict usually means chaos, that felt almost revolutionary. By the end of the day, millions had watched the clip. Some were inspired. Some were frustrated. But almost everyone had an opinion. And that was the point. Because conversations like this don't end when the cameras turn off. They begin there. So now we turn it to you. What did you think of this exchange? Do you agree with Matthew's belief in conversation and understanding? Or do you side with Whoopi's call for urgency and accountability? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here. And if you want more powerful cinematic stories that take you inside moments like this, make sure you subscribe to the Truth Narrator, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to see it. Because sometimes, the most dramatic clashes aren't the ones filled with shouting. They're the ones filled with words that make us think long after the noise fades.